The dust was a living thing in West Texas, a gritty beast that coated Jedediah's tongue and settled in the deep lines around his eyes. For 3 days, he'd been walking, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. His horse had gone lame 2 days back, and he'd had to leave the poor creature behind with a bullet and a prayer. Now, his own reserves were gone. The hunger was a hollow ache that had turned into a dizzying weakness. He stumbled, catching himself on a split-rail fence that looked as weary as he felt. Through the heat shimmer, he saw it. A small ranch house, humble and weathered, with a curl of smoke whispering from its stone chimney. It was a sign of life in a land that seemed determined to bake it out of him. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He pushed open the gate, the hinges groaning in protest, and walked the short path to the porch. Each step was a negotiation between his will and his failing body. He raised a trembling hand and knocked, the sound startlingly loud in the vast silence. He waited, leaning against the post, his head bowed. He heard the shuffle of feet, the slide of a bolt. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face appeared in the sliver of shade. She was younger than he expected, with wary eyes and a jaw set with a firmness that belied the visible swell of her pregnancy beneath her simple cotton dress. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clear and steady, devoid of warmth or welcome. Jedediah swallowed, the effort painful. "Ma'am," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. I mean no harm, I need water. Maybe a bit of work for some food. Anything?" Her eyes swept over him. A quick, assessing glance that took in his tattered clothes, the gauntness of his cheeks, and the desperation he knew was plain on his face. He expected the door to close, to be told to move on. He'd seen that look before, but she held his gaze for a long moment, a silent calculation happening behind her eyes. Then, without a word, she closed the door. Jed's heart sank. It was over. He should turn around, keep walking until he collapsed. But then he heard the bolt slide again. The door swung open fully. The woman stood there, but she wasn't holding a plate of bread or a glass of water. In her hands, she held a long, heavy Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with use. She held it out to him, not threateningly, but as an offering. "The coyotes have been stalking the chicken coop every night since my husband passed," she said, her tone all business. "The fence by the north pasture is down, and I can't risk my last few head of cattle wandering off. You want to earn a meal? Fine, there's your work. Keep the coyotes away and fix that fence. Then you can have a seat at my table. Until then, the barn is dry and you can draw water from the well." The weight of the Winchester was a shock, a heavy, cold anchor in his trembling hands. Jedediah watched as the door clicked shut, the sound echoing the finality of her terms. He was alone again, but now with a purpose tethered to his survival. He took a long, slow swallow from the canteen she'd given him, the water a blessed relief on his parched throat, and resisted the urge to drain it. Discipline, that's what this would take. First, assess the enemy. Not the coyotes, but the weakness of the perimeter. He started with the fence, walking its length with a slow, deliberate pace that conserved his dwindling energy. The Texas sun was merciless, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the wooden posts to a ghostly white. The break Alara had mentioned was obvious, a splintered post and 2 sagging lines of wire, but Jedediah's experienced eye saw more. He saw 3 other posts rotted at the base, ready to give way with the slightest pressure. He saw sections where the wire was rusted thin, a determined predator's snap away from uselessness. The chicken coop was no better, its door hanging slightly askew on one hinge, the wire mesh on its window brittle with age. From the kitchen window, partially obscured by a faded floral curtain, Alara watched him. She saw he wasn't rushing to the obvious break. Instead, he was walking the entire line, his head down, studying the ground, the posts, the wire. A flicker of something other than suspicion stirred within her. Any fool could patch a hole. It took a careful man to look for the next one. Her hand went to her swollen belly, a subconscious, protective gesture. This wasn't just about chickens, it was about holding this place together until her child was born. For the first time, she felt a sliver of hope that this stranger might be more than just another drifter. Jedediah found a small, forgotten pile of scrap near a dilapidated shed. A few sun-warped planks, a coil of rusty but still usable baling wire, and a heavy mallet with a cracked handle. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The work was agonizing. Every swing of the mallet sent a jolt through his famished body. The dry air seared his lungs, and sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision. He focused on the most critical section first, using the planks to brace the rotting post and weaving the old wire into a crude but strong patch. His hands, already calloused, were quickly rubbed raw. As the sun began its descent, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and purple, a deep chill started to settle over the plains. He had secured the weakest points, a temporary but vital defense. Exhausted, caked in dust and grime, he walked back toward the house. He wasn't demanding his meal yet. He was simply reporting for the next phase of his duty. Just as his shadow stretched long across the porch steps, a sound cut through the evening calm. It started as a single, high-pitched yip, then was answered by a chorus of hungry howls from the low hills. The coyotes were on the move, their calls growing closer. Jedediah's head snapped up, his gaze locking onto the horizon. He gripped the Winchester, the cold steel no longer just a tool, but a promise he now had to keep. The howls drew closer, not a chorus of triumph, but a series of sharp, tactical yips as the pack coordinated its approach. Jedediah didn't wait on the porch. He moved silently towards the chicken coop, the scent of dust and poultry thick in the cool night air. He chose a spot behind an old water trough, its rusted metal offering solid cover. The rifle felt heavy, but steady in his hands. He wasn't just a man with a gun. He was a hunter, and the familiar tension settled over him, sharpening his senses and pushing back the gnawing hunger. Inside the small ranch house, Alara sat stiffly in a wooden chair, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. Every sound from outside was magnified in the suffocating silence of the room. The frantic clucking of the chickens began, a wave of panic that sent a sympathetic chill down her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing the splintering wood, the scattering feathers, the inevitable loss. This was why her husband, David, had built the fences so strong. And it was why their disrepair felt like a personal failure, a wound in the heart of their homestead. A shadow detached itself from the taller brush at the edge of the property. Then another. The coyotes moved with a fluid confidence, their lean bodies slinking low to the ground. They were smart, testing the air, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Jedediah held his breath. He didn't aim for the first one he saw. He waited, tracking the leader, a larger, bolder animal that directed the others with subtle shifts in posture. He knew that chaos would only scatter them, and they'd return. He needed to make a statement. The lead coyote crept towards a section of the fence Jedediah had temporarily patched. It paused, sniffing at the new wire, and then let out a low growl, signaling the others to probe for a weaker point near the coop. That was the moment. Jedediah exhaled slowly, aligned the sights, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack was a singular, deafening clap that shattered the night. It echoed across the plains, sharp and final. Alara flinched violently in her chair, a gasp escaping her lips. Then, an unnerving silence descended, broken only by the whimpering retreat of the pack and the fading sound of paws on dry earth. Jedediah stayed put for a long minute, listening, ensuring they were truly gone. He rose, his legs trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, and did a slow, careful walk of the perimeter. The lead coyote lay still near the fence line. The chickens were safe. He walked back to the house and leaned against a porch post, the rifle held loosely at his side. The front door creaked open. Alara stood in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight, her expression a mixture of shock and profound relief. She looked from him to the darkness and back again. She said nothing, but simply stepped aside, holding the door open. It was an invitation. He had earned his meal. The pale morning light filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, finding Jedediah already awake. His muscles ached with a deep, satisfying soreness, a world away from the gnawing pain of hunger. The meal from the night before sat in his stomach like a promise. He knew that promise had to be earned today and every day after, until the fences were whole again. He found a stack of weathered cedar posts and a rusty post hole digger near the barn. The work was brutal. The West Texas ground was baked hard as stone, resisting every thrust of the digger. Sweat soaked through his thin shirt within the first hour, stinging his eyes and tasting of salt and dust. He worked methodically, his movements economical, a rhythm born of long experience. Dig the hole, set the post, tamp the earth, move on. Each thud of the tamper was a small victory against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Around midday, as the sun beat down with its full, merciless force, the screen door of the farmhouse creaked open. Ilara emerged, carrying a tin cup of water. She didn't come close, stopping a respectful distance away, her pregnant belly a prominent silhouette against the blinding sky. "You'll cook your brain out in the sun," she said, her voice flat, but the gesture itself spoke volumes. She set the cup on a fence post near him. He paused, wiping his forehead with the back of a grimy hand. "Much obliged, ma'am." He drank the water slowly, letting the coolness seep into him. It was the most refreshing thing he'd ever tasted. "Where'd you learn to set a fence?" she asked, her arms crossed over her chest, a shield of caution still firmly in place. "Had a ranch of my own once," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "A long time ago." He offered no more, and she didn't press. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of insects and the distant cry of a hawk. Just as he was about to resume his work, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke the quiet. A dusty Ford truck, with the county sheriff's star emblazoned on the door, rumbled up the long driveway. A stocky man in his late 50s with a weathered face and a thick mustache climbed out. His eyes immediately fell on Jedediah, and his expression hardened with suspicion. "Ilara," the sheriff called out, his voice a low rumble of authority. "What's going on here? Who's this fella?" Ilara's posture stiffened. "Sheriff Miller. This is Jedediah. He's a hired hand, fixing the fences for me." Sheriff Miller's gaze swept over Jedediah's worn clothes and gaunt frame. "A hired hand? Ilara, you know better than to take in drifters. Especially now." He gestured vaguely toward her stomach. "It ain't safe." Jedediah stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the post-hole digger, every muscle tense. He could feel the weight of the sheriff's mistrust, the possibility of being run off just as he'd found a foothold. His fate rested entirely on the word of the woman he'd met less than a day ago. Ilara took a step forward, placing herself between the two men. "He earned his keep last night, Sheriff. Ran off a pack of coyotes that would have had my chickens. He works hard, and I need the help." Her voice was steady, resolute. "He's staying." The declaration hung in the hot, still air. The sheriff held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly nodded, his suspicion giving way to grudging acceptance. "All right, Ilara, it's your land, but you call me if there's any trouble. You hear?" "I will," she said. As the sheriff's truck disappeared down the drive in a cloud of dust, Jedediah met Ilara's eyes. No words were needed. She had taken a risk, vouching for a stranger against the counsel of a friend. In that moment, the arrangement shifted. It was no longer just a transaction of labor for food. It was an alliance, forged in the dust and sealed with a quiet act of defiance. The days following Sheriff Miller's visit fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. The initial tension between Ilara and Jedediah softened, replaced by a quiet, shared solitude. He would rise before dawn, his silhouette moving toward the fence line as the first pale light broke over the plains. Ilara would watch him for a moment from the kitchen window, her hand resting on her swelling belly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He worked with a relentless focus, his movements economical and sure, slowly transforming the dilapidated fences into a formidable barrier. She tended to her garden, cared for the chickens, and managed the household, the two of them orbiting each other in a space defined by mutual purpose, but still separated by unspoken histories. Their fragile peace was shattered one scorching afternoon by the groaning death of the water pump. One moment, it was chugging along with its familiar, rhythmic sigh. The next, A jarring clang echoed across the yard, followed by an unnerving silence. Ilara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. What was that? Jedediah was already walking toward the well. The pump, he said, his voice grim. Without that water, the livestock would be in jeopardy within a day, and the house not long after. He assessed the rusted machinery with a practiced eye, while Ilara stood nearby, her brow furrowed with worry. It's the main piston rod. Looks like it finally sheared off, he announced, pointing to the fractured metal. I can probably fix it, but I'll need help holding the casing steady while I try to reseat it. It's heavy. It was the first time he had asked her for anything directly since his arrival. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of distrust, but out of a sudden awareness of her own physical limitations. Then, she nodded. All right. Tell me what you need me to do. They worked side by side under the oppressive Texas sun, the shared crisis erasing the distance between them. He guided her, his voice patient, as she used a long pry bar to hold a heavy piece of iron in place while he worked inside the pump's greasy innards. Sweat beaded on both their foreheads. During a brief pause to catch their breath, Ilara leaned against the well housing. Liam always said he could fix this thing with a kick and a prayer, she murmured, the name hanging in the air between them. It was the first time she had spoken of her late husband. Jedediah stopped his work, looking at her. He saw the flicker of grief in her eyes and felt a need to offer something in return. We had one just like it on our place, he said quietly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. Before I lost it. The admission was sparse, but it carried the weight of a long story. A shared current of loss passed between them. He had lost a ranch, she had lost a husband. Both were adrift. He turned back to the task, and with a final, concerted effort, they managed to seat the repaired rod. A few minutes later, with a triumphant squeal, the pump coughed back to life, and cool, clean water gushed into the trough. They didn't celebrate, but as they shared a dipper of the fresh water, a new understanding had settled. They weren't just a widow and a hired hand anymore, they were partners in survival. Word in a small West Texas town travels faster than a dust storm. Sheriff Miller, stopping for coffee at Miller's Mercantile the next morning, found himself the unwilling center of that storm. Martha Miller, the store owner's wife and the town's unofficial curator of concerns, cornered him by the pickle barrel. Sheriff, you saw him with your own eyes, she pressed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. A stranger, out there with that poor, pregnant girl? It's not right. Liam hasn't been gone a year. Sheriff Miller sighed, swirling the dark liquid in his mug. He's a hired hand, Martha. Ilara was clear on that. The man's working, not lounging. But Martha wasn't convinced. Concern, sharpened by a lifetime of small-town gossip, etched lines on her face. She packed a basket with a freshly baked apple pie and a jar of her best peach preserves. It was an offering of peace, but also a key to open a door she felt compelled to peer behind. When her dusty Ford truck pulled up to the ranch, Ilara was on the porch, mending one of Liam's old work shirts. Jedediah was out in the near pasture, methodically replacing a rotten fence post. He saw the truck but kept his head down, giving Ilara space to handle her own affairs. He was her employee, not her keeper. Ilara, dear, Martha said, climbing the porch steps with the basket extended. I was so worried when I heard. I just had to come and see for myself that you were all right. I'm fine, Martha. But thank you for the pie, Ilara said, her tone polite but firm. She didn't invite the older woman inside. Martha's eyes darted towards the pasture. Is that him? Sheriff Miller said you'd hired help. It is. His name is Jedediah, Ilara replied, her gaze steady. The fences were falling apart. I can't do that kind of work myself right now. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, a simple gesture that was both a statement of fact and a shield. But a complete stranger, a man, is it wise? Martha's voice was laced with manufactured sympathy. People will talk. They'll say you're not thinking of Liam or the baby. The words were meant to sting, to sow doubt. But Ilara felt a surprising surge of defiance. She thought of the repaired pump, the secure livestock, the quiet respect Jedediah had shown her. "What people say is their business," Alara said, her voice dropping, gaining a strength that surprised even herself. "My business is keeping this ranch running for my child. Jedediah is a decent man who needed work, and I needed help. He's earned his keep and my trust. That's all there is to it." As if on cue, a young calf, spooked by the unfamiliar truck, slipped through a gap in the fence near the barn. Before Alara could even call out, Jedediah had put down his tools, walked calmly toward the animal, and gently coaxed it back into the enclosure, securing the gate behind it with a quiet efficiency that was impossible to ignore. He didn't look at the porch, he simply went back to his work. Martha watched the entire exchange, her mouth slightly agape. She saw not a dangerous drifter, but a competent man tending to his responsibilities. She looked back at Alara, who stood taller and more resolute than Martha had ever seen her. The visit ended soon after. As Martha's truck disappeared down the lane, Jedediah approached the porch. He stopped at the bottom step, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. Alara simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had faced the town's judgment together, and their fragile partnership now felt like something forged in steel. The sky had turned a bruised, gunmetal gray when the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the small farmhouse, and the wind howled like the very coyotes Jedediah had driven away. Inside, a log fire crackled, a fragile bastion of warmth against the tempest. Alara stood by the window, one hand on her swollen belly, when a sharp, unfamiliar pain seized her. She gasped, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the windowsill. Another contraction, stronger this time, answered the rumble of thunder outside. Jedediah, who had been cleaning a harness by the fire, was on his feet in an instant. "Alara, what is it?" "The baby," she breathed, her face pale in the flickering light. "It's too soon." Panic was a cold, useless thing, and Jedediah pushed it down. He strode to the old wall-mounted telephone and cranked the handle. Nothing. The line was dead, a casualty of the storm. They were alone. His gaze met Alara's, and in that moment he was no longer just the hired hand. He was the only person she could rely on. "All right," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "We're going to town. I'll get the truck ready." He worked with a grim efficiency that belied the storm's fury. He laid a pile of clean blankets in the passenger seat of his old pickup and helped Alara into the cab, her jaw clenched against the waves of pain. The journey was a nightmare. The dirt road had turned into a treacherous river of mud, and the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. The truck slid and groaned, its engine straining. Jedediah's hands were clamped to the steering wheel, his focus absolute as he navigated the slick, winding path, glancing at Alara with every lurch of the vehicle. They finally burst out of the rural darkness and onto the main street of town, pulling up to the small clinic. Its lights were a beacon of hope. Without a word, Jedediah lifted Alara from the truck and carried her through the driving rain, kicking the clinic door open. Dr. Adams, roused by the commotion, took over immediately. Hours later, as the storm quieted to a gentle patter, the cries of a newborn filled the sterile hallway. Jedediah sat slumped in a waiting room chair, covered in mud and exhaustion, when Sheriff Miller walked in. The lawman didn't look suspicious anymore. He simply looked at Jedediah, then toward the room where Alara was and gave a slow nod. "Heard you brought her in. That was a rough drive tonight." "She needed help," Jedediah said, his voice raspy. The sheriff's expression softened. "Looks like you were the right man for the job, in more ways than one." It was the closest thing to an apology and an acceptance Jedediah could have imagined. When he was finally allowed in, he found Alara holding a tiny, swaddled bundle. Her face was tired but luminous. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's a boy," she whispered. Jedediah approached the bed slowly, his dusty hat held in his hands. He looked down at the infant's perfect, sleeping face, a life he had helped bring safely into the world. The ranch, the fences, the coyotes, it all led to this. To a new beginning. "He needs a strong name," Alara said, her gaze steady on his. "I was thinking Liam Jedediah." Jedediah's throat tightened. He couldn't speak, only nod as he reached out a calloused finger, gently stroking the baby's cheek. In that quiet room, with the storm finally past, the cowboy, the widow, and the newborn were no longer just survivors. They were a family.